We just generally call it UNEP CTAC instead of spelling it all out as well. So thank you all. I'm really pleased to be back in New Zealand. One of the previous speakers talked about New Zealand being one of the most sustainable countries. I travel around the world, and I would think New Zealand is probably the #1, or certainly in the top 2 or 3 sustainable countries in the world. So congratulations to you all. You've done a great job. I'm sure there's a lot of work to be done, but you're really right up there in my perspective. What I want to do today is talk about hotspot analysis. Many companies and organizations are beginning to look at what are the important things that I'm doing. What are the important things that matter to me? And so all the questions that we've been talking about, purpose and what matters, are all key to this. But while they're also hearing from stakeholders, from the governments, from NGOs, they have this issue I've got to be concerned about. And so what they don't really have a handle on is how do you evaluate that? How do you make a decision about which of those stakeholders, which of those issues are most critical to me and meaningful to me? And so the UN Environmental Program in Paris brought myself and a gentleman from the UK, and we're co-chairs of a project called the Hotspot Analysis for the UNEP CTAC Life Cycle Initiative program of the of the CTAC, UNEP, and all the kinds of things that we just heard about. So what I want to do then is to spend a little bit of time on what hotspot analysis is. So this over here is the no, I was just saying, I was trying to look at the 3 slides here. So what hotspot analysis is really is a rapid assimilation of information to really identify what are those most important issues, life cycle stages, that if you can identify actors for and work on developing solutions, that when you implement those solutions, you're actually going to get the next generation of product sector be more sustainable. So there's an analytical process that we're working through. It's a methodological framework, but it really is all about how to look at a whole range of issues, both environmental and social, and then identifying what are the most important ones for me, and then being able to identify who the actors are that you want to be able to, who could influence that, and then make the actual changes. So this is what we talk about hotspot analysis. Some of the work that UNEP CTAC has done, we did a phase 1 report of this project. It was published about a year ago. And basically it's a mapping of hotspot analysis methodology. We found there was like 44 different methodologies around the world, people being done by the Sustainable Consortium, the EU's PIF program, the RAP's work on the Product Sustainability Forum, some of the work that we've been doing with the appliance industry and public gardens, which we'll talk about some of those examples. But this is an excellent forum to really compare, contrast 44 different methodological frameworks for doing hotspot analysis. And the document is up here. We're in the middle of phase 2 now, which is actually developing that methodological framework, which we'll make public in October for public comment period through the RAP website. So if you're interested in getting feedback or providing feedback in it or getting a copy, give me your business card and we'll make sure that you get alerted to when that's available. But this is an excellent forum for us in terms of really looking at hotspot analysis. So a little bit of an overview. What we've been finding in hotspot analysis is that the whole purpose of this is to really identify the goal and scope, which is tempered to life cycle assessment language, but what are the issues that you want to really identify? Where are the life cycle stages you want to look at? What's the sector? What's the product? And then a key part of that is then a series of data. Hotspot analysis has been done by the life cycle community for a long time. When you talk to people in the LCA community, they simply say, oh, we do hotspot analysis. But what LCAs don't do is look at all possible social impacts, environmental impacts. It looks at more of a smaller subset of that. And so what we're seeing now is that what we're looking from a hotspot analysis perspective, there's a whole variety of different data that's used, and it's a very iterative process. So then what you end up doing is going through that process, identifying the hotspots, which is sort of it's a means to the end, but it's not the end in itself. You have to get to the point of identifying what are those hotspots for which then you can identify and prioritize actions. When we were on talking this stuff with Mark Patel of the UK, what we ended up doing is that we were working on it, developing standards. And Dominic talked about standards. You have a standard you can meet or not meet. and you can change and improve those standards over time. We were developing for the appliance industry and others some product sustainability standards that for refrigerators, if you want a next generation of refrigerators to be more sustainable, then you meet these standards and then it will be more sustainable and you can go through a certification process and so forth. But what RAP had done was really providing guidance to the sector for them to make changes and more in sort of an indirect fashion as opposed to having a standard. So we're beginning to see all of a sudden there were multiple applications for the hotspot analysis. So that was a key sort of an overall framework for it. I want to give you, I think, 3 examples here going forward. This is some work was done by RAP, the Product Sustainability Forum with UK Potatoes. And what they had done with a hotspot analysis is they had looked at, you see in the top, they look at waste, greenhouse gases, energy, water, material risk, and then the typical sort of life cycle stages, agriculture, packaging, so forth. And then they began to look at various impacts associated with energy use, irrigation, consumer cooking goods, and a variety of other things. So this became sort of a model of saying, okay, these are the areas which the dark red or the hot spots, the yellow is more of a, sort of cool spots or warm area, but not as important. But what they found when they actually went through and getting people who were actively involved in the product life cycle activity, what they found is that they were screening at the farm potatoes through a 45 millimeter screen. And what they found that 45 millimeters was just set arbitrarily by somebody a long time ago. So they changed that screen size to 43 millimeters, which allowed sort of less to go through, and so more were available for commercial purposes. The consumer did not see any difference, and basically it created about 1,000 pounds per hectare more revenue for the farm. So this goes back to what we heard already. There's an environmental benefit as well as a business benefit associated with this. So this is what we're reoccurring theme. We're looking at environmental impacts and social impacts improvement as well as business value improvement. So I think this is a good example, and you go on the RAP website, there are dozens and dozens of different food examples like this. They have really good reference. Another example is that we worked with the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers back in America. And what they were interested in doing at this point in time, you had different standard bodies who were coming in, and each of them wanted to set what the product sustainability standards for appliances were, whether refrigerators or ovens or some small appliances. And basically the industry got together and said, well, we don't really want someone else to come in and tell us what should be the sustainability standards. We want to work with the standard bodies. We want to work with the NGOs, governments, the retailers together in a collaborative program. And so what AHAM had done was basically reach out to those standard bodies, reached out then to the governments and the retailers, and really put a task force together and a stakeholder advisory council to really develop appliance standards. But they did that through a hotspot analysis methodology. And so what they ended up doing, and this is sort of the overall framework for it, is they looked at additional literature information that was out there. They looked at LCA studies. They interviewed experts and technical people in the field to really identify what some preliminary hotspot analysis were. And what they end up coming up with was sort of this initial framing of hotspots. It's similar like we saw with potato. You got various, in this case it was flipped around, but you got life cycle stages in the top, and you got social and environmental impacts, sort of on the rows, and different levels of concern. But when you look at appliances, and you think about the Energy Star program that's been on appliances for a long, long time, it's always been the energy and the use stage. And if you look at the graphs of energy and the use stage, it sort of comes down and it really levels off. They're really getting to the point of diminishing returns in terms of the amount of, sort of reduction in energy that could be done. But things like materials of concern, the refrigerants, the foaming agents, what happens to the appliance at the end of life? We're not really part of that whole Energy Star, program. So what this hotspot analysis did to the actual industry folks and the people involved with the standard writing body, and then they took this out to the stakeholders, the retailers, the government people, and so forth. And then so they went through this process, and what they found, they didn't have enough information to say, okay, these were the actual impacts that we needed to be looking at. And what they ended up doing then was doing an LCA, or life cycle assessment, of that to really help refine the process, and they went through to the point of actually developing a standard. So this was the initial hotspot analysis, but what they ended up doing afterwards, based on input from the stakeholders, input from the technical resources within the company, simply saying if you looked at LCA information, it would say that 70% of the criteria that you would use to determine what a sustainable refrigerator was would be energy. 70% of the criteria would be related to energy. But things like materials, the refrigerants, the foaming agents that were used in the actual refrigerator was down to a very small percentage if you use that based on LCA. But when you incorporate the science with sort of the technical value judgments coupled with the broader stakeholder input, what you then found was they developed a different set of criteria where energy consumed was only 45% of the total scoring related to developing a standard, as opposed to 70%. The materials concerned, the materials, the refrigerants, the foaming agents, et cetera, was not just a few percent, but was 25%. So all of a sudden, you saw an opportunity then. You built science-based, but you bring the value judgment into it with the technical expertise, and you come up with a broader stakeholder-accepted set of criteria that if the standard then is used to set the next generation of sustainable refrigerators, then it will be accepted by not only the industry, but by stakeholders, the users, and so forth. So I think this was a good example of where the industry came together with the purpose to really drive a more product sustainable standards, as well as making sure that the stakeholders were engaged early and throughout the process. So it's a good example. They're still working on standards going through the variety of appliances in the industry. And Whirlpool, just to finish up, we had a conversation with Whirlpool last week, and they have taken this product sustainability standards and going through a range of new refrigeration units coming out of Whirlpool that will meet the standards, so they are actually advertising on the UL website a variety of criteria and standards that they've met. So it's a good example of taking it, remember the process, taking it through, identifying the right goals, identifying the hotspots, identifying actors and actions to take to improve it, and then actually taking the next step of using that information to drive change, to accelerate change, so you actually get the next product coming out that's more sustainable. So the next example I want to speak to is some work that was done in public gardens. Longwood Gardens, which is located in southeast Pennsylvania, where I live in the States, is probably one of the premier gardens, at least in the US. They've been active, they've been a leadership, they're a legacy from the DuPont family. And what they were interested in doing was setting, okay, if you're going to do a garden that's sustainable, public garden that's sustainable, what does that mean? Does it mean we use less water? Do we use less energy? What happens to all those plants that we sort of cycle out every 3 months? I mean, we compost them or so forth. So they had all these questions. So we put together a task force of 15 different public gardens across North America and developed what came out to be a sustainable index for gardens. And it was actually a very good process. We went through and listed 50 to 60 different possible issues and impacts that could be associated with gardens, and actually had a broad stakeholder engagement process where we surveyed people, we got expert information, we got stakeholder information, and we're able to take those and narrow them down to a smaller number. So here you have a number of these being the environmental, the traditional water quality, wastewater, greenhouse gas, et cetera. But you also had social. A lot of the sustainability hotspot analysis has been focused really on the environmental piece, but you also had to have the social piece in it, so we had that. We also realized that there needed to be some financial planning. The gentleman was talking about, the president of Longwood Gardens says, with the climate change, what our availability of water in the future will be? What if we can't get the plants we can because of the climate change and things like that? So we began to look at it from a strategic standpoint. And the other part, which I think was really innovative, was we talk about social and environmental and sort of economic. We've been hearing about that for a long time. It's like the three legs of a stool. You've got, the social, environmental, and economic, or financial in this case, and they're fine three legs. But if you don't have the seat, which is we call the governance piece, you don't really have a stool. So to me, the governance is the foundational piece. It's what's happening within an organization in terms of its strategy, in terms of the business strategy piece. How's that linked to the management systems, the performance activities and the tools and data. So the governance became a really critical piece of this product or public garden sustainability standard. And so these were the attributes, but having an attribute was sort of essential but not sufficient. What we then did was develop a workbook. For each of those attributes, we had a set of criteria that had to be met if you want that garden to be sustainable. So this was an example of plant conservation. The attribute said conservation of plants, communities, associated habitats, and ecosystems throughout the public garden. And so that was the attribute. But then it went over on the sort of the checked red area. There were specific criteria. It was things that had to be met by a public garden. And then it also gave examples here of tips. And there were 3 different examples of public gardens who had a proven practice of how they actually met that. So here again, you went through a hotspot analysis process to identify what are those areas of issue, what are those areas of importance, because they can't do everything. They do one that's really most critical to them. They identified that, and they said, well, how are we going to measure it? How are we going to get the facts and figures to prove that we're actually meeting those criteria that's set up? And so that was part of the process, and then we set the criteria and examples. So if I'm a public garden and I don't have this, I can begin to look at, the plant conservation criteria and say, what do I need to do to meet that, and what are the criteria? These are examples, and then there's people I can go and talk to demonstrate that I know how to do that and also help me do it. So this became a very useful tool that the Public Garden Association is using across North America. So finally, I would just like to sort of close with this 2 more slides here. Why should I care? When I think about hotspot analysis and I think about companies who are being asked by lots of people to change their behavior, to do things differently, and we talked to the board of directors. I'm a stakeholder advisory council to a board of directors in a major chemical company in Germany, and we talk all the time. What are the things I should be focusing in on? And we talk about, because they're really confused. They want to do the right thing, but they're not sustainability experts. They're not environmental experts. They're not social experts. They're CEOs and board of directors because that's their experience. But they want to do the right things. And so what we find for hotspot analysis, it's a methodology, it's a tool, it's a framework, it's a way of thinking to basically help them identify based on what are the right issues, what are the right life cycle stages that are critical. Is it in my own operations? Is it in the supplier? Is it in my user, by the consumer? Or is it in the raw materials that I select into my product? What are those issues? Are we working on the right life cycle phases? And the other thing is, once you start identifying what those hotspots are, who are the actors? Who are the people that could actually do something about it? I mean, sometimes you have this solution, you say, we've got this impact, but I have no clue. Who does that? Who manages that in my company? Because often, I think we talked about the CSR people, the sustainability people are sort of off over here. You got the business people here and the material selection people over here, the marketing people over here, the innovation people over here. You got a bunch of silos. And as one of the speakers said already, unless you begin to talk the language of the CFO, the marketing person, the innovation people, you're not going to make that connection. And so what this does is help you, what are those hotspots and why they are important, where in the life cycle stages are, who are the right people you need to engage with to be able to identify, then you work together, and some may be outside the company, you work together to really identify those actions you need to take, and then ultimately take those actions. And this is why we're seeing so much interest right now. The United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, has programs going on in the tourist sector, in various different countries, and a variety of things all over the world, because they see the hotspot analysis is a way to help prioritize, because we have limited resources, but we want to have the impact to make the change we want, and also to have the business value that we talk about. So, final point in my 3 seconds is to, we're phase 2 of the hotspot analysis project with UNEP. We're working on the module 3 sector level, product category level. The methodological framework will be out for consultation and review in October. If you want to have information on it, you can give me your card, and I'll make sure that you're alerted to it when so we have input. Phase 3 will start in 2017 to look at it at a city scale, country scale, and then doing a lot of testing of the methodology. So if there's interest in here in New Zealand to try and use the methodological framework, we'd love to talk to you and have you go forward. So thank you all for your time, and I hope that I provided some perspectives on hotspot analysis as a way to help you focus your limited resources to derive impacts as well as business benefit. Thank you. Oh. One more thing. Sorry, I forgot.
It's never going to fit me.
So in the, you'll see some people at the at coffee and at lunch wearing these shirts, and I'll be wearing my shirt. I just didn't want to put it on now. But for the work stream 4, in terms of internal influence, we have a series of questions, and we really want your input, and we've got whiteboards out there, because not all of you will be able to attend the session, because there's other sessions going on. We want your input, and then we'll have a panelist provide input to answer some of these questions. So my question is, who is your other half? So come to me and talk. My wife said, it's me, Jim, but come to me. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.